So we've been hearing back and forth over the course of the day some very general problems and policy considerations and some very detailed technical presentations, and we're just doing a little bit of each so that when you think through the policy issues, you'll have some basis from which to understand the scope of the problem and the opportunity to solve them. I'm going to ask Jeff Weiss to come back up again. What's interesting as he introduces the Honorable James Woolsey to us, Jeff has had a background which many of you can appreciate, because if you're in information technology, you're called an IT person. If you're in information and communications technology, you're an IC person. But what's best is if you could be an information, communications, and energy technology person, then you're an ICT person. And it's a lot more refreshing. And it gives you the big picture of what goes on. Well, what's interesting about Ambassador Woolsey, too, is his broad background, because when you've been impacted by many of these things, you get the big picture, which very often moves you to action than only having the small picture, because you always assume, well, somebody else has this covered. But right now I'd like to bring Jeff up, who would give us a moment to introduce our next speaker, Jeff Weiss, who is a microgrid entrepreneur and a fellow very active in the Ben studies on microgrids and military bases. Jeff.
Thank you, Chuck. So I'm here to introduce the Honorable R. James Woolsey, who is he who needs no introduction. Jim asked me if I knew what he was doing since I was asked to introduce him, and for those of you who don't know this already, Jim is no longer Director of Central Intelligence, so you're here for that. You're in the wrong room. He's no longer Ambassador to the Negotiation on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe. He's no longer Undersecretary of Defense. He's no longer General Counsel to the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee. He is Chairman of Woolsey Partners, and he is venture partner with Lux Capital. So if you're interested in energy and need funds, broadly from a technology and deployment point of view, Jim's your man. Talk to him. I'd like a show of hands. Who in the room loves oil? Who in the room loves those who we buy oil from? So depending on your answer to those questions, you have something to talk to Jim about. Jim has taught us all about our dependence on oil. There's a television program called CSI. Some people think it has another moniker. From some points of view, it's named for Jim. Jim is connected, strategic, and invested. So with no further ado, please meet Jim Woolsey.
Thanks, Jeff. Is this microphone on? Sounds like it may be. Honored to be asked to be with you today. My background is not technical. I had 6 years of Latin years ago when I should have been taking chemistry and physics, but so be it. I want to put one basic distinction in front of you in hopes that people will always understand that when they're dealing with the country's security and major systems, they cannot look just at naturally occurring or naturally caused events. Terrorists are smarter than tree branches. We had tree branches knocked down to transformers during the storms a few months ago at our farm near Annapolis. Had that been planned, it could well have taken out the electricity for a huge area of eastern Maryland. As it was 25 homes on a country road. Transformers were relatively small. They were available. Took a few days. 25 cherry pickers, 25 utility engineers, work people, knew the systems from Arkansas, actually, and put it back together again. It can have a bigger reason, the electric grid that is, our electricity system, can have a bigger reason to go down. Some time back, I believe in 2003, a tree branches are quite sneaky things. touched a power line in Cleveland, and after several hours of hacking around and confusion, some 80 gigawatts went offline in 40 seconds, taking out electricity for some 50 million people in the U.S. And Canada, many of those parts of the U.S. and Canada out of electricity for well over a week. We tried to adopt a rather familiar tactic, at least to those of you who have children or grandchildren who watch South Park, namely to blame Canada. But in their polite way, our Canadian friends pointed out to us that actually Cleveland is south of Lake Erie, not north, and it was our power line and our transformer that went down, and our tree branch. Tree branches touching transformers is what I call a malignant problem. Malignant problems can sometimes be relatively small, although naturally occurring. Not only malignancy in the sense of cancer, but let's say ease of taking a system down because of its complexity. Butterfly effect. Butterfly flutters his wings on one side of the globe, cascading change as a result of the complicated interaction of systems, tornado on the other side of the world. But malignant problems, however difficult they may be, and our electricity grid is highly susceptible to them. However difficult, however problematical they may be, they are generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, far easier to deal with than what I call malevolent problems. Problems in which there is an intelligence on the other side who is trying to figure out how to destroy your systems, or, worst of all, how to kill as many of you as possible. We have an electric grid. I feel like Henny Youngman, the comedian. Take the electricity grid, please. We have an electricity grid whose construction was begun in the late 19th century, and in its own way, it's a marvel, possibly the biggest and most complex machine in the world, and it generally works. But we have only had, as we built our American infrastructure for electricity, we have only had, over the century and a quarter about, that we've had something like a grid, we've only had a very brief period of time, just before and just after, actually, Pearl Harbor, when we were worried, because of Japanese and German submarines off the east and west coast, we were worried about some type of intentional disruption or attack on American infrastructure. Our whole infrastructure was really put together because of the two oceans that surround us and shield us from many of the world's problems. Our infrastructure was put together without, on the whole, a single thought being given to intentionally caused harm. Our infrastructure is put together for ease of access, for convenience, for engineering efficiency, but to figure out how to design it so that a terrorist can't take down half a dozen of just the right transformers, which he knows about from the web, and thereby take out a substantial share of the country's operations. Nobody was thinking about that when they put the grid together, and nobody generally has thought about those kinds of problems at all. They seem too crazy. They seem too paranoid or something. But electricity has lots of potential enemies. The grid has potential enemies, in a sense, to its smooth operation. I want to touch on just three of them here. There are many experts in this audience who know much more about the engineering issues and the technical issues of this than I do. But first of all, we have physical destruction. If a tree branch falls on a transformer, as it did at the edge of our farm, it may break up the transformer, it may need to be replaced, but the tree branch doesn't go after the transformer right at the edge of the National Security Agency or the Pentagon or others that may be so large they have no spares, or if they do have spares, the utility figuring it didn't want to cause the terrorists too much trouble, will put the spare transformer right beside the operating transformer. And just to make it clear what you ought to shoot at with your armor-piercing round, they put danger, do not touch, every place or someplace you should shoot if you're a terrorist. The grid is not designed for security against malevolent interference. It is as bad as systems get in that regard. One of the reasons it stays bad and vulnerable is because partially of the utility financing system, which puts a great penalty on any added cost of electricity to consumers. It's partly because of our liability system, in which if you raise these issues with utility executives, and there are ones that have spent some time actually thinking about these issues at all, you will find that there's no real sense of wanting to even talk about these issues, much less write anything about them, because the General Counsel has told you that if something bad happens, and there are any emails around or any memoranda of record of discussion, could mean big liabilities for the company, so don't talk about it. Don't even think about it. There's a willful blindness about the interest in potentially hostile countries in physical attacks on our grid. One of the big interconnect organizations, I won't name it, a few years ago had a very smart electrical engineer from a large country with a sophisticated military, say that, come to him and say, I'm doing research on electric grids. I wonder if you could let me have the maps of your grid so I can see where all the transformers are and so forth. And the government relations person, the interconnect company, picked up the phone and called the State Department. And the State Department said, sure, he's from this country we want to get along with, so let's be nice to him. So he spent months, verging toward a year, going through all of the control systems very thoroughly, taking notes and so forth. And then finally, this issue, somebody worried about it a little bit, and it bobbed up to the top of one of our national regulatory commissions. And there was a call to this gentleman from the foreign country, and the regulatory commission individual said, well, we understand you've been working on this for months and months, and we're interested, we'd like to compare notes, we're interested to see what you've learned and what your notes say. And the gentleman from the foreign country said, sure, absolutely. I'll come to Washington the day after tomorrow. He said, fine. And then the next day, he flew back home. The degree of naivete and lack of willingness to put yourselves in the shoes of those who would do malevolent harm, it's the only way to do it. Figure out how you could create the biggest problem, then figure out how to defend against it. That whole sequence of thinking that is second nature to people in many parts of our military and the like, as far as I've been able to tell, is almost completely absent in the electric business. Almost totally and completely absent. So, in addition to the malignant problem of a tree branch touching a power line, got to be thinking about the malevolent problem of terrorists or others with, say, physical attacks on the electric grid. And if you don't, you come up with major national debates on things like whether or not to put transmission lines underground. And the only subject being debated is expense and so forth. If you say, you know, if you go to the expense of putting them underground and you're doing something thereby about tree branches, but you're not doing a damn thing, spending a nickel on figuring out how to keep terrorists from taking out transformers or otherwise physically attacking the grid, is this really, shouldn't you have a little broader debate? And you get back basically deer in the headlights. Look. The second way in which we could suffer very serious harm from intentional, malevolent interference with the electric grid is, of course, hacking, cyber vulnerabilities. Back in the late 90s, as the web was moving into greater and greater use, people were intrigued by the low cost of passing information across it. And we were at the same time trying to deal with Y2K, so there was a lot of openness and willingness to think about changing the control systems of things like the utility grid. People had a great idea. Hey, let's save money by putting the SCADA systems, the control systems for the grid over the web. And then the communication will be cheap, and it'll be easy, and what could go wrong? Well, there's one example of the kind of thing that can go wrong with the internet, bless it, which was put together by some individuals who in equal measure were geniuses and are, the ones who are still here, geniuses, but who also lack several of them, a certain sense of suspicion or concern or security, thinking what could go wrong. That chain of thinking has led to some rather substantial difficulties. Take the SIPRNet, which is the secret level internet that has hundreds of thousands of people on it with secret level and below security clearances, but not the very highest security clearances, but several 100,000 people on it. That system was penetrated by one teenage private first class who put a thumb drive in, downloaded hundreds of thousands of classified State Department cables, gave them to WikiLeaks, and as they were published all over the world, the people died. People who had been candid with American ambassadors, with senior officials in our government, and now showed up on WikiLeaks for having said X to the American ambassador. Some of them were doing what they thought was right for their country, but they were being more candid with the Americans than their country wanted. And in some of those countries, they solved that problem by killing these people. So if one teenage private first class can get into one of our country's most secure networks, modeled after the internet, now tell me why anybody thinks that you can't get past the firewalls and the SCADA systems into the heart of our electric grid. My youngest son is a pretty good hacker. I'm not. But I've got to say, I have, in the several years I've been working on these issues, never run into anyone who thinks that the SCADA systems, as they are now, unprotected, operating over the web, are anything but a potential disaster as far as malevolent interference is concerned. And burying the transmission lines or other types of fixes that focus on essentially malignant problems will not deal with malevolent problems. One can, of course, also, and we should, worry very much about electromagnetic pulse of several kinds. Now, set aside the solar events for a minute. Those are things that we should deal with. We should have the right types of transmission systems and the rest so that we don't end up with the same kind of problem from the sun that we could have from malevolent interference. But the sun, at least, is not controlled by, say, China or Russia or Hezbollah or whomever. The sun will do what it does when it does it. In the meantime, we need to hedge, of course, against some types of malignant problems such as that, as well as malevolent ones. But the malevolent ones, with respect to electromagnetic pulse, are likely, at least in my mind, to be an extraordinarily severe problem. Why do I say this? Are people going to be launching nuclear weapons everywhere casually in order to just cause trouble for our electric grid? No. But the difficulty that's presented is that particularly as the number of nuclear powers begins to increase, the circumstances in which something could happen accidentally by way of a launch increase probably at some exponential level. PBS has a 1-hour presentation that just was on television a few weeks ago called The Man Who Saved the World about in 1962, the Soviet commander of the 4 submarines off Cuba that had nuclear torpedoes, how he decided and enforced his decision against the 2 other people who had keys to launch. Having decided to launch, he held out and kept the launch from occurring. I guarantee watching that show is a bit bracing from the point of view of anyone who might be inclined to say, well, nothing like that could ever happen. We also know from releases in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union back 20 years ago, we know that Castro was doing everything possible to urge the use by the Soviets of a nuclear weapon. And he did not care that Cuba would be destroyed if he thought the United States would be destroyed. This is all very well chronicled in the Soviet materials. And Castro is not even a religious fanatic. He's just a communist fanatic. So we also have to look at circumstances which could arise because countries such as Venezuela or countries that could have a fishing boat that could contain a scud, some 40 countries have scuds, all you really need to do is get close enough to the United States to launch up several hundred kilometers, and you might think, well, surely we're able to shoot something like that down. No, we have no deployed systems that are designed to deal with anything in the ascent phase. They're designed to deal at mid-course and in terminal, deal with a system that is shooting at a target on the land. But if your target is several hundred clicks up, because all you want to do is detonate in space in order to cause an EMP effect, you don't need to have accurate systems. You just need to be able to launch something that has the right nuclear characteristics, not absolutely simple, but not rocket science in a sense. And this whole vulnerability that can be caused and could manifest itself in launches from someplace like Venezuela, from fishing boats with a scud in it, with the way the Iranians have practiced launching. All of these possibilities exist. It is not likely in some sense that there's a way you can put a number on it and we're sure the number is X rather than Y. It's just an understanding that in a Mideast, after Iran gets a nuclear weapon, where that means probably Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, and maybe some other Middle Eastern nations will have nuclear weapons, the next crisis in the Middle East could well produce some use of nuclear weapons. If any of them happen to be in the Western Hemisphere, fired up several hundred kilometers, while still ascending, being detonated, we could, I have to tell this group, lose a substantial share of our electric grid. And of course, since we have in the electric grid only one of the 18 critical infrastructures in the country, water, sewage, etc., but it is still the case that all of the others depend on electricity. So as millions of people found out, the various storms and small hurricanes and so forth this past spring and summer and fall, one can end up losing electricity, and then one finds that nothing else works. How can we deal with some of these? There are lots of ways. You're going to be more involved in it than I. I tend to be very favorably disposed toward distributed generation, toward improved storage, so that one can put generation capacity where the load is, where possible, systems that can island easily, systems that can make it possible for electricity to be used in such a way that even if you can't have all of your electricity, even if the military base has its soldiers and airmen pretending they're in England and drinking warm beer and taking cold showers, nonetheless, if the runway lights operate, the task-critical assets can function, and the base can still conduct its mission. Same with hospitals, police stations, and so forth. There are ways to work on the possibility of keeping a bare bones, at least, of electricity generation, even if major systems, transformers, transmission lines, etc., have gone down. I don't offer any very specific solution here, but it is an issue and an area that in the investment community people are starting to look at very hard, how to mate up affordable and safe storage of energy, particularly electricity, but not exclusively, but mainly, let's say, electricity, in such a way that we can have at least 20 or 30 or 40% of our electricity if the grid goes down. I think those three ought to be enough for a reasonable assignment, even to as knowledgeable and able a group as this. The key thing, however, is, as far as I'm concerned, not to let anyone get away with the proposition, what could go wrong? The only thing that could go wrong is something that is natural. The sun will do what the sun does. Tree branches will do what tree branches do when they fall. And if we deal with that set of problems, for the tree branches we bury the transmission lines, for example, then we've done all we need to do. Wrong. You would be just getting started. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Woolsey. You brought forth the whole issue of what local folks can do rather than just wait for somebody in Washington to take care of them. There's something you can do at the local level. I'd like to make certain if there's a question or two before we do the next panel, you could begin to form a line here if there's anyone with a question. The next panel you're going to see will be including entrepreneurs who are doing various technologies at the local level, some local power generation and storage. You'll see someone doing off-grid buildings and also cybersecurity technology that's just emerging. But I would like, if someone is coming down for a question, have you answer at least one, is, this is a tough issue. There are a lot of technologies there, but from the standpoint of leadership and what people can do at the local level, other than just starting to learn more about this technology that they can use themselves, as we move forward down this path, is there anything that you would give us some guidance on in terms of leadership or what to do in the face of other people who are saying it can't possibly be a problem because I haven't heard of this before? What kind of guidance might you give us sort of as a coach in the middle of halftime for the rest of us?
Well, I think the key thing is that with electricity, to a first approximation, there is no upper level. There's nobody in charge. There is FERC that deals with transmission regulation, financial regulation, and has, I think, an able staff, able people. But the standards, such as they are for energy security, are kind of sort of set by NERC. NERC, of course, being a perfectly reasonable trade association of utilities. Try to think of the last war you think was won in which the general of one side was a trade association of hundreds of businesses. That's not a good instrumentality for figuring out how to deal with an enemy that may be trying to destroy you. It's not just that it's not good, it's nuts. There are several people at DOE who deal with electricity, but there is essentially nobody in charge at a national level. You got 50 public utility commissions, mainly retired utility executives. They're very sympathetic to the idea that you never want to add any cost because the public won't like that. As a result of that, R&D, there is more spent every year on research and development of dog food than research and development of improving the electric grid.
I guess we don't have an appetite for it.
Right, yeah. There's all sorts of other associations with dogs one could make in these circumstances. But the point is that if anything useful happens, it's almost certainly going to be at the local level. It's almost certainly going to be people beginning to build some resilience into their home systems with solar and batteries in the basement and the rest. And the big enemy of this is the assumption that you've got to get everything, that it's got to be perfect, that it's got to be a complete substitute for all the electricity you could ever want on a good day. And it's the wrong way to think of it. The way to think of it is, I think I mentioned in the remarks, is how can you keep going? Now, we probably don't want to go this small, but I understand now in Bangladesh it is possible on markets in the street corners and so forth to buy about a $25 kit. And that kit contains 2 or 3 solar panels, several watts, not hundreds of watts, not kilowatt, watts, a cell phone charger, 3 LEDs, a tiny fan, and a radio. And what's interesting about that is if you can have LEDs, the children can read at night, improves the school system. The fan can keep you cool even in a Bangladeshi summer if you're in the shade. All of these things are carefully chosen, and for an extra about $40, you can get a tiny refrigerator, which is largely in those cultures used for refrigerating the medicine for animals. Because if you have a refrigerator, you'll have medicine and your animals will be healthier than other people's animals, and that's a very big deal. Now that is bare bones, okay? We don't have to go that bare bones in order to have something that is modest but useful and can still keep you functioning and in connection with the world and not freezing to death and so on with a few tens of dollars or hundreds of dollars of systems, many of which might be designed to deal with campers and so forth. There are a number of possibilities here to look at ways to get the very, very basics of what one needs. Probably most people are going to want to be interested in being above that level, but you don't have to have it perfect. And I would put more confidence in average Americans and in the free enterprise system to come up with some of these types of systems than I would anything regulatory having to do with electricity, in which so far, the more I study it, the less confidence I have in the way we do it.
Thank you, Ambassador Woolsey. And I would invite everyone to take a 10-second in-place stretch and give our distinguished speaker a round of applause.
Thank you.